She had always been invisible to them, just another black woman in a world too quick to judge, too eager to belittle. But on this flight, when the flight attendant slapped her without a second thought, she was forced to confront the prejudice that defined her existence. Little did they know, this was no ordinary woman. Zara owned the jet, and soon they'd learn exactly who they had crossed. Watch until the end to see how this incredible story unfolds, and let us know what time you're watching today. The hum of the airplane's engines was constant, a low, almost comforting sound that only seemed to intensify with altitude. Above the clouds, the world felt distant and untouchable, yet the sharp contrast of the well-lit interior of the first-class cabin made everything feel intensely close, as though every passenger's actions, every breath, were magnified in the sterile, air-conditioned atmosphere. The air was thick with the scent of freshly brewed coffee, a hint of expensive cologne, and the faint smell of something artificial, like the synthetic air they breathed in these confined spaces. Yet none of these small details seemed to matter to the passengers settling into their plush seats, each lost in their own private worlds. Among them, a woman sat alone by the window. Her name was Zara Bennett, and on the surface, she was just another businesswoman in her late 30s, dressed sharply in an elegant suit, her features striking but softened by the grace of someone who had mastered the art of being unnoticed when needed. She was one of those women whose presence, although powerful, never quite demanded attention. But Zara wasn't looking for attention today. Not from the strangers around her. Not from anyone. As the plane ascended, she pressed her forehead gently against the cool window, watching the sprawling city below shrink into the horizon. Her mind, however, wasn't on the breathtaking view. Instead, her thoughts were elsewhere, deep in the past, to a time when the world wasn't so predictable, when people weren't as quick to assume who she was and what she could do. A quiet sigh escaped her lips, and she closed her eyes, letting the sound of the engines drown out her racing thoughts. Her fingers subconsciously traced the polished surface of the armrest, her pulse still quickening despite the calm exterior she wore. It had been years since she had felt this kind of unease, but today, it was there, lodged in her chest, a feeling she hadn't quite managed to shake, no matter how hard she tried. It wasn't the flight. No, Zara was far more accustomed to the thrill of travel than most people realized. It was the anticipation of the conversation she was about to have when she arrived, the tension that she felt building like the pressure before a storm. She was close, so close now to reaching her destination, an important one, but this flight had a different feel. Something was going to happen. She could feel it in the air, as palpable as the weight of the clouds they cut through. Something was already shifting, and she couldn't quite put her finger on it. "Would you like a drink, ma'am?" A voice broke through her thoughts. Zara opened her eyes and looked up, meeting the gaze of a flight attendant. A woman in her late 20s, with a precise smile and a posture too rigid to seem natural. She had that look, the kind of attention to detail that came from years of catering to wealthy passengers who had expectations of perfection. Zara's gaze flickered briefly to the attendant's name tag, Lily. She could tell from the woman's posture, the way she stood slightly too stiffly, that she was new to this level of service. The kind of woman who was probably still afraid of making a mistake in front of her superiors. "No, thank you," Zara replied, her voice low but firm, her eyes never leaving the attendant's face. The attendant hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded quickly and moved to the next row of seats. But Zara's eyes didn't follow her. She remained fixed on the window, watching the world below, her mind still racing. Something about the way the flight attendant had looked at her, had addressed her, nagged at her, but she pushed the feeling aside. She had other things to focus on now. Suddenly, a loud voice cut through the quiet hum of the cabin. It came from a man seated several rows in front of her, near the front of the cabin. His voice, booming in a way that suggested he felt the need to assert his presence, made several passengers look up from their books or phones. The man was well-dressed, a sharp-suited figure with the kind of expensive watch that seemed to catch the light with every exaggerated gesture. "Excuse me," he barked, glancing over his shoulder at the flight attendant who had just passed by. "Could you please come here?" Zara's eyes darted in the direction of the voice, her fingers tightening around the armrest again. She could sense a shift, a sense of rising tension in the cabin. The man's tone had been rude, condescending even. Something told her that this wasn't a mere request. It was a demand, one he believed he had the right to make. Lily appeared immediately, walking briskly toward him with that too-perfect smile still plastered on her face. She bent down to hear him better, her posture softening in a way that showed she was doing everything she could to meet the man's needs. "I'm sorry, sir," Lily said, her voice polite but strained. "How may I assist you?" The man leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms with a smug smile on his face. "I don't want any more of your cheap wine. I'm a frequent flyer. I'm used to better than this. Don't you have something better, or do you only serve this swill to your most important customers?" Zara's lips pressed together as she watched the exchange unfold. She could feel her pulse begin to quicken, the tiny ember of tension that had been building in her chest now flaring into something more visceral. The man's entitled, dismissive tone, it wasn't just a simple request. It was a statement of power, of dominance, as if he expected to get whatever he wanted without question, without hesitation. Zara had dealt with people like him her entire life. She knew the kind of person he was, and she knew what was coming. Lily's eyes flashed with a brief flicker of embarrassment, but she quickly regained her composure. "I'll bring you a different selection, sir," she replied, trying to appease him, but it was too late. The man wasn't interested in an apology. "No, that's not good enough." His voice rose now, drawing the attention of a few more passengers. Zara glanced briefly around, noting the glances exchanged by the people seated nearby. They all seemed to understand what was happening. The man was about to make an example of the young flight attendant. Zara shifted in her seat, her eyes narrowing, as the man's behavior began to escalate. She could feel the air grow thicker with each passing second. Every time Lily tried to defuse the situation, the man dug in deeper, demanding more, speaking louder, becoming more aggressive with each word. He wanted to break her, wanted to show her, and everyone else, that he could get away with anything. Then, as the flight attendant turned to walk away and returned to the galley, her face flushed with humiliation, something snapped. Without any warning, the man rose from his seat and walked quickly toward her, cutting off her path. The moment seemed to slow. Zara's eyes widened as the man raised his hand, not in a gesture of assistance, but in anger. And then, with a sharp crack, his hand collided with the back of Lily's head, sending her stumbling forward. Zara's heart stopped in her chest. A murmur of shock swept through the cabin, but it was Zara who stood first, her voice ringing out sharply across the room. "Don't you dare." The man froze, his eyes snapping toward her, as if he just realized who had spoken. For a brief moment, the plane seemed to be suspended in time, the tension crackling in the air. "I said, don't you dare," Zara repeated, her voice colder now, laced with a firmness that came from years of knowing exactly when to stand her ground. The man scoffed, brushing it off with a smirk. "And what will you do about it?" Zara didn't blink. "I'm the one who owns this plane," she said, her tone not boasting but matter-of-fact. "And you will apologize to her, now." A heavy silence fell over the cabin. For the first time, the man's confident exterior faltered. His eyes widened slightly, his posture shifting as the weight of her words settled in. He took an uneasy step back, glancing around the cabin as if hoping someone would confirm whether she was bluffing. Zara held his gaze, unflinching. "I'm not asking. Apologize." The man opened his mouth to protest, but the words died on his tongue as he glanced again at the flight attendant, her hand to her head, a mix of shock and disbelief written across her face. Zara stood still, her eyes never leaving the man. She could feel the energy in the room shift, an undercurrent of power, of justice, rising with the weight of her declaration. The man finally muttered an apology, his voice low, reluctant. But Zara didn't care for his words. She cared for the fact that, for once, someone had been made to feel the consequences of their actions. The cabin had fallen silent once Zara's command had rung out. The man who had slapped the flight attendant, a wealthy, self-assured man used to getting his way, had been brought to heel with a single, measured sentence. But the tension in the air hadn't dissipated. Instead, it lingered, a palpable reminder that Zara Bennett was far from an ordinary woman. Zara took a slow breath, her gaze scanning the cabin once more. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, some filled with curiosity, some with admiration, others with a touch of fear. They all knew that something had shifted, that Zara was not someone they could simply ignore. The young flight attendant, Lily, looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief, still trying to process the strange sequence of events. Zara settled back into her seat, her fingers lightly tapping against the armrest. She wasn't someone who liked to draw attention to herself, but there was something about moments like this, when the balance of power was so clearly upset, that made her feel alive in a way that she couldn't quite explain. The pulse of power, of control. She had known it for years, had cultivated it with precision. She wasn't simply wealthy. She was untouchable, and that was a power few could comprehend. Yet Zara wasn't here to prove herself to anyone. This trip, this flight, it wasn't about her power, not really. It was about something far more personal. She needed to get to her destination, to face the confrontation waiting for her on the other side. The world she had built for herself, the empire she had constructed with blood, sweat, and tears. Everything had led to this moment. She glanced out the window again, watching the endless expanse of clouds stretch below them, feeling the weight of the decision that loomed ahead. But then, the door to the cockpit opened, and Jackson Graves, the flight captain, stepped into the cabin. Tall, with a strong jawline and dark, intense eyes, Jackson had the kind of presence that commanded respect without asking for it. His uniform was immaculate, every crease in place, yet there was something about the way he moved that suggested a quiet authority, one that came from years of experience in the skies. Zara had met Jackson before. They were familiar with each other, though their relationship had always been somewhat transactional, rooted in a shared professional respect, but little else. She knew that he had been flying for years, a seasoned captain with a reputation for getting his passengers safely to their destinations. But today, Zara sensed something different in him. His eyes flicked over to her, then away again, but it was the briefest of moments, just enough for Zara to sense an unspoken understanding between them. "Everything okay here?" Jackson's voice cut through the tension, his eyes scanning the cabin before landing on Zara. It was a question, but it was more of a formality than anything else. Jackson didn't need to ask. He knew. Zara was in control. "It's fine now," Zara said, her voice smooth, her gaze unwavering. "A little misunderstanding, but it's handled." Jackson nodded, a brief smile flickering on his lips, and he moved on, back to the cockpit. He was the kind of man who didn't need to get involved unless absolutely necessary, and Zara respected that. She wasn't here to cause trouble. She just wanted the flight to pass quietly, or so she thought. Meanwhile, across the aisle, Lily, the flight attendant, was still grappling with the situation that had unfolded. She had seen passengers lose their temper before, but this was different. There was something about Zara, the way she had asserted herself, that had shaken Lily to her core. It was as though Zara had commanded not just the situation, but the very space itself. Lily couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude mixed with awe. She had always wanted to be more than just another face in the crowd, a nameless figure in the background. But now, standing in the midst of this high-stakes encounter, she was forced to reckon with the disparity between her life and Zara's. The kind of power that Zara wielded effortlessly was a far cry from the world Lily had grown up in, a world where survival meant staying small, staying quiet. Lily's eyes lingered on Zara for a moment longer, drawn to the calm confidence that radiated from her. It was a stark contrast to the trembling uncertainty Lily felt within herself. She wanted to be like Zara, wanted to command respect in the same way, to never apologize for existing in a world that constantly tried to diminish her. But then, just as quickly, she forced her gaze down, moving away to continue with her duties. She couldn't let herself get distracted. Not when she had to prove herself. Not when she had so many other things to prove. As the flight progressed, Zara remained lost in her thoughts, the quiet hum of the engines blending into the background as she considered the chain of events that had led her here. The wealthy businesswoman, the untouchable figure who ruled her empire with meticulous precision. Yet, despite everything she had, Zara was on the brink of losing it all. Her mind wandered back to the past few weeks. Her corporation was in turmoil. The foundation she had so carefully built now beginning to crack under pressure. She had trusted people she had believed were loyal to her. But loyalty, in Zara's world, was a currency that could be traded away in an instant. She had learned that lesson too many times, and now it was threatening to destroy everything she had worked for. The whispers of betrayal were growing louder. Her business partner, Victoria Hawke, had been acting suspiciously. Zara had noticed the subtle changes in her demeanor over the past few months. The small signs of distance, the shift in her tone whenever they spoke about their upcoming project. Zara had never been one to ignore her instincts. She had a sixth sense for when something was off, and right now, everything felt off. And then, there was the matter of her private life. Zara wasn't the kind of woman who shared much about herself, but a small part of her, an ever-growing part, felt the pull of a life she had never allowed herself to have. She had buried her personal desires deep, sacrificing everything for the pursuit of success. Yet, as she sat on this plane, heading toward the unknown, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything she had been running from was finally catching up to her. Zara was beginning to realize that she couldn't keep going like this forever. She had built her life on power, on control. But at what cost? She was starting to wonder if she had sacrificed her humanity in the process. And now, as her plane cut through the skies toward her destination, Zara knew that the confrontation she had been avoiding for so long was waiting for her. Back in the front of the cabin, as the captain prepared to announce their descent, Lily couldn't help but glance back at Zara again. She was still so far away from the life that Zara had. But what if there was something more to it? Something that made Zara more than just a powerful businesswoman? As the plane began its descent, the familiar hum of the engines shifted slightly. Zara's pulse quickened, not from fear, but from something more primal. This wasn't just another business trip. This was the beginning of something new, something unpredictable, and Zara wasn't sure if she was ready for it. But it was already too late. The low, mechanical hum of the plane was almost soothing as it sliced through the clouds. For a moment, Zara closed her eyes, trying to block out the swirl of thoughts racing in her mind. The quiet calm of the sky was a contrast to the chaos waiting for her below. She could feel the weight of what she was carrying, both physically and emotionally, her business, her empire, and a growing sense of dread that refused to let her breathe. She had put this off for far too long. Her fingers drummed lightly on the edge of her seat as she glanced at her watch. They were descending now, but the hours spent in the air had given her no clarity. She had come up with no answers, no plan of action. Zara's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden sound of the overhead compartments shaking. It was brief, barely enough to register, but then a second, stronger jolt sent the plane tilting to the side. A few gasps echoed through the cabin. The captain's voice came over the intercom, cutting through the rising tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a slight turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until further notice." Zara's grip tightened on the armrest. It wasn't the turbulence itself that rattled her. It was the way the plane felt, too sharp, too sudden. There was something more to it. She wasn't just another passenger. She had been through countless flights in her lifetime, always aware of every subtle shift in the air, every dip and rise. But this was different. From her peripheral vision, she saw Lily, the flight attendant, hurrying down the aisle, trying to reassure the passengers. Her face was pale, and she glanced nervously at Zara. There was a distinct look of confusion in Lily's eyes, a flicker of something unspoken. Zara caught her gaze, but instead of offering comfort, she felt the tension between them increase. She could sense that Lily was just as unsettled by the disturbance as she was. Suddenly, A sharp thud echoed from the front of the plane, followed by a louder noise, metal scraping against metal. The passengers around her stiffened, looking up with wide eyes. Zara's heart beat faster. Her intuition, always sharp, told her that this wasn't just turbulence. Something was wrong. Lily stumbled back toward Zara, her face now filled with a mix of panic and determination. "Stay calm," she said, her voice betraying a hint of fear. "Please stay calm, everyone." But Zara was already out of her seat, her eyes trained on the narrow corridor ahead. She moved quickly, her every instinct pushing her toward the source of the disturbance. "Zara, please," Lily called after her, but she was already too far ahead. As Zara made her way toward the front of the plane, she could hear the muffled shouts, the sound of chaos building, and the unmistakable scream of the emergency alarm. She had been in enough high-pressure situations to know that this was no ordinary emergency. The fear that had been creeping up her spine was now fully awakened. She rounded the corner, her eyes immediately falling on the cockpit door. The flight crew was in disarray, and she could see through the narrow opening of the door that the captain, Jackson Graves, was struggling to regain control of the plane. His brow was furrowed, his hands gripping the controls as if trying to stabilize the plane. But it was clear that something was terribly wrong. Without thinking, Zara moved closer, her mind racing. She wasn't trained for emergencies like this, but she had been trained for moments of extreme pressure. She knew how to keep her cool, how to think on her feet. "Captain Graves," she called out, her voice cutting through the noise of emergency alarms. "What's happening?" The captain didn't respond at first, his focus entirely on the plane's controls. His face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead. Zara could see him trying to steer the plane, but his movements were erratic. Something was wrong, very wrong. "Captain Graves." Zara's voice was sharper this time, a note of command underlying her words. She was used to being in control, but the situation was spiraling out of her reach. Finally, he looked at her, his eyes wild with fear. "We've lost control of the engine. Something's happened to the autopilot system. We're going down." Zara's blood ran cold. She heard that before on the rare occasions when things went wrong. "We're going down." But the tone in Jackson's voice, the desperation in his eyes, told her that this wasn't an exaggeration. This was real. "What do you need me to do?" Zara asked, though she had no idea what she could possibly do to help. Jackson glanced at her, his eyes flicking over the cockpit controls before landing on her face. For a split second, there was something like recognition there, but was quickly replaced with uncertainty. "Stay back," he said. This is beyond anyone's control right now." But before Zara could step back, the plane lurched again. This time, it felt more violent. The whole cabin groaned, as if the metal itself was protesting the impact. People screamed, the cabin filled with a cacophony of gasps, cries, and the sound of the overhead compartments rattling open. Zara stumbled, her hand reaching out for support. She didn't know what was happening, but everything inside her told her it was much bigger than a simple malfunction. This wasn't just about a plane. This was about control, and Zara Bennett always understood control. The emergency lights flickered to life, bathing the plane in an eerie red glow. The cabin, once serene and quiet, was now a place of chaos, with passengers shouting at each other, some crying, some desperately trying to reach their loved ones. Zara's mind raced. She couldn't just stand there. She needed to act. She needed to understand what was happening. Turning, she made her way down the aisle, her eyes scanning the passengers. Her thoughts were a blur, but she knew that something larger than just a mechanical failure was at play here. Someone had to be behind this. Someone was manipulating the situation. She stopped, her gaze locking onto one man in particular, a passenger sitting near the back, his face hidden in shadow. There was something about him that made her uneasy, a look of cool detachment as he remained seated while everyone around him panicked. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, the world seemed to freeze. The tension between them was palpable, and in that brief exchange, Zara felt a sudden, sharp sense of foreboding. This wasn't just an accident. It was a setup. She turned quickly, heading back toward the front, her mind already shifting to the next phase of the plan. She needed to get to the cockpit, find out who was responsible for this, and take control of the situation. She wasn't just a passenger. She was the owner of this plane, and no one was going to take that away from her. This begins the inciting incident, with the plane going into a state of emergency, raising the stakes, and foreshadowing that this event is no mere accident. It's part of a larger, more dangerous plot that Zara will have to face head-on. The emergency landing had been nothing short of a nightmare. Zara's mind was still reeling from the chaos as the plane skidded along the runway, and the shrill wail of the emergency sirens pierced the air. As the aircraft finally came to a halt, the cabin was eerily silent except for the frantic shuffling of passengers, the frantic gasps of fear still hanging in the air. Zara's legs shook as she unbuckled her seatbelt, still grappling with the realization that they had made it, barely. Her thoughts, however, were already elsewhere. The plan had been simple. Once the plane was grounded, she would figure out who was behind the incident, take control, and secure her safety. But now, as she gazed out the window at the flashing lights of the emergency vehicles surrounding the plane, she could sense that everything had just become infinitely more complicated. The doors opened, and passengers poured out of the plane. Zara remained seated, taking a steadying breath, trying to regain composure. Her eyes scanned the faces of those around her, and it was as though she was seeing them for the first time. Fear, suspicion, and uncertainty were now painted on their faces. The plane had been grounded, but the danger hadn't disappeared. Something deeper was happening, and Zara could feel it. The calm before a storm. "Zara!" A voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see Jackson Graves standing in the aisle, his face ashen, but there was something else. Something she couldn't place. It wasn't just the shock of the emergency that unsettled him. Something in his eyes had shifted. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low. Zara nodded, though her mind was far from calm. She wasn't entirely sure of the answer to that question. "What happened, Jackson?" "The engine failure. It wasn't just a malfunction, was it?" Jackson hesitated for a moment, then slowly shook his head. "No, it wasn't. There's something more going on." He trailed off, looking around nervously. Zara's stomach tightened as she stood up, adjusting her jacket. She needed to know more, but before she could ask any further questions, Lily approached them, her face pinched with worry. The flight attendant's eyes darted from Jackson to Zara, a visible unease washing over her. "You need to come with me," Lily said in a hurried whisper, glancing over her shoulder as if to make sure no one was listening. "It's not over. There's something else we need to figure out." Zara's brow furrowed. "What's going on? Why aren't you telling me?" Lily took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw him, the man you locked eyes with earlier. I don't know who he is, but he's been acting strange ever since the Turbulent started. I think he's involved in whatever happened to the plane." Zara's pulse quickened. She'd known something was off about that man. "Where is he?" Lily hesitated, then pointed toward the back of the plane, where the emergency exit had been opened. "He's near the rear. He's been trying to stay out of sight, but I saw him slip out. Something's not right." Without a second thought, Zara nodded. She needed to confront him, find out what he knew, if anything. But as she began to make her way toward the back of the plane, a sudden thought struck her. What if this wasn't just about the plane? What if it was about her? Was she the target? The realization hit her like a punch in the gut. She wasn't just a passenger. She was the owner, and someone had put her in danger. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that this wasn't a random incident. The turbulence, the engine failure, it was all too orchestrated, too precise. Whoever was behind it, they were coming for her. The corridor was eerily quiet as Zara made her way toward the rear of the plane. She could feel the tension in the air, and the passengers who had remained on board were now murmuring among themselves, casting glances in her direction. It was as if they could sense it too, the rising threat that loomed over them all. As she neared the back, she spotted the man Lily had mentioned. He was standing near the emergency exit, his posture relaxed, but with an air of detachment that didn't match the panic around him. He was tall, with dark hair, wearing a nondescript suit. His face, though calm, was unreadable, his eyes sharp, taking in everything. Zara's instincts flared as she approached him, her gaze never leaving his face. There was something about him that unnerved her. He wasn't acting like the other passengers, frantic, disoriented, fearful. He was composed, too composed. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I need to speak with you." He turned slowly to face her, his lips curling into a slight, almost imperceptible smile. "Of course," he said, his voice smooth, like he had been expecting her. "I saw you earlier," Zara continued, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You didn't seem as shaken as everyone else. You knew something, didn't you?" The man's eyes flickered briefly, but he didn't show any other sign of surprise. "You're perceptive," he said, the hint of a compliment in his voice. "But I'm afraid you're mistaken. I was just—" "Don't lie," Zara interrupted. "Something happened to that plane, and you were involved." He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slight tilt of his head, he finally spoke. "I'm not the one you should be worried about." Her heart skipped a beat. The words were chilling, spoken so casually, as if they were nothing more than an observation. Zara's suspicion grew, and her mind began to race. Who was he working for? What was his role in this? And what did he mean by those words? Before she could press further, a new voice echoed from behind her. "Is there a problem here, Zara?" Zara spun around to find her security detail, Marcus, standing behind her. His eyes were scanning the man with a look of professional caution. Marcus was a towering figure, built like a bodyguard, and he exuded a quiet strength that always made Zara feel safe. But now, there was something off about him too. His demeanor was different than usual, almost too composed, too guarded. "What are you doing here?" Zara asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. "I was just making sure you're all right," Marcus said, his voice too smooth, too rehearsed. His gaze never left the stranger. Zara glanced back at the man. There was something in his eyes now, an understanding, a silent agreement that Zara couldn't yet decipher. And it only made her more uneasy. "I'll leave you to it," the man said, his voice laced with amusement. "But don't trust anyone on this plane, not even your security." Zara's blood ran cold. His words hit her like a warning she hadn't wanted to hear. He turned and disappeared into the crowd of passengers, his back straight, every movement deliberate. It was like watching a predator slip into the shadows. As Marcus moved to follow the man, Zara's mind was already racing. The realization had dawned on her. The threat wasn't just external. It was inside the plane, and she couldn't trust anyone, not even those who had been loyal to her. The air inside the private lounge was thick with tension as Zara sat across from Marcus, her eyes scanning his face for any sign of deception. The lavish surroundings, the soft leather chairs, the golden accents, the view of the skyline through the massive glass windows, seemed too serene, too perfect for the chaos that was unfolding. Zara's pulse raced, but she fought to keep her composure. She could sense that something had shifted, something fundamental. Marcus had been her protector for years, but now, every word he spoke seemed carefully measured, as if he were trying to control the very air between them. Zara had known him long enough to understand when he was hiding something, and today, it was impossible to ignore the distance that had crept between them. His jaw clenched when she asked questions, his gaze darting briefly when the conversation took an unexpected turn. It was subtle, but it was enough to make her doubt everything. "Marcus," Zara said, her voice steady but filled with unspoken weight. "I need to know the truth about what's going on here. The plane, the engine failure, and you." He shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping on the armrest, an old habit that betrayed his anxiety. "What do you mean, Zara? You know the protocol. Everything's been handled." But the flatness of his response only deepened her suspicion. "That's not good enough. Something isn't right. There's too much about this situation that doesn't add up. I can feel it. A silence stretched between them, thick with the unsaid. Marcus avoided her gaze, his eyes flickering toward the door, as if hoping someone would intervene, something would happen to change the course of this conversation. But Zara wasn't going to let this go. Not now. You said I was safe, she continued, her voice gaining strength. But now I'm questioning whether that was ever true. At the mention of safety, Marcus' expression hardened. His posture straightened, and for a moment, it seemed like the man she knew had returned. But the coldness that followed quickly extinguished that hope. You don't understand, Zara, he said, his voice low and careful, as though speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile control he had left. I've been doing everything I can to protect you, but this isn't something I can control anymore. It's bigger than both of us. Zara leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. Big. What do you mean? What's going on? There was a long pause, and then Marcus did something he'd never done before. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, unmarked envelope. The paper was thin, almost translucent, and felt like it had been handled countless times, edges worn and creased. He slid it across the table without a word, his eyes not meeting hers. Zara's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment that would either confirm her worst fears or change everything she thought she knew. She took the envelope, her fingers trembling as she opened it. Inside was a single photograph, black and white, showing a much younger version of Marcus, standing beside a man she didn't recognize. The man in the picture was tall, with dark, sharp features and a commanding presence. There was a sense of familiarity in his expression, but it was the shadow in his eyes that struck her, the same shadow that haunted Marcus' every movement. On the back of the photo, in barely legible handwriting, were the words, "Trust no one, not even Marcus." Zara's mind whirled. This was a warning, a message, and it was meant for her. She looked up from the photograph, her voice barely a whisper. "Marcus, what is this?" The room seemed to grow colder, the distant hum of the city below muffled as if the walls were closing in on them. Marcus' face had drained of all color, and his eyes shifted away from her, his gaze distant, his lips pressed into a thin line. His jaw clenched as if he were trying to fight back a torrent of emotions. But it was clear. He was hiding something, something monumental. "I never wanted you to know this," he said quietly, his voice thick with regret. "But you're in the middle of something far more dangerous than I could have ever prepared you for." Zara's pulse raced, the weight of his words sinking deep into her chest. The reality of the situation was dawning on her. All the whispers of betrayal, of hidden agendas, were becoming real. "Who is he?" Zara demanded, her voice sharp as ice. "Who is the man in the photo?" Marcus didn't answer immediately, his eyes flickering as if he was measuring the consequences of each word. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "His name is Victor Donovan," Marcus said, his voice low and filled with a mixture of dread and guilt. "He's the one who orchestrated the plane's malfunction, and he's the one who's been pulling the strings behind everything that's happening." Zara's stomach dropped. The name struck her like a blow to the gut. Victor Donovan was a name she had heard only in whispers, a shadow in the upper echelons of business and power, a man who controlled more than she could comprehend. But hearing it now from Marcus' mouth brought it all into sharp, terrifying focus. "What do you mean he's been pulling the strings?" Zara's voice cracked, but she fought to maintain control. "How do you know him? What's your connection?" Marcus' gaze hardened, his eyes darkening. He stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. "I've been protecting you because I owe a debt to him," he admitted, his back turned to her. "A debt I never wanted to pay. But Victor, he has leverage. He has things on me, things I can't escape." Zara's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of information. Marcus was involved with Donovan. That explained so much. The strange hesitance in his voice, the way he had always kept his distance. But it didn't make sense. How could someone like Marcus, someone she had trusted so completely, be entangled with a man like Victor Donovan. You were never going to tell me, were you? Zara whispered, the betrayal settling like a cold weight in her chest. All this time, you've been keeping me in the dark, using me. Zara, no, Marcus pleaded, turning back to face her. I never wanted this. But you have to understand, there are things at play here that are bigger than both of us. Victor doesn't just want control over you. He wants to destroy you. He wants everything you've built, and he's willing to tear it all apart to do it. Zara felt the walls close in, her chest tightening. She had been blinded by her trust in Marcus, in her own strength. But now everything had changed. This wasn't just about a plain malfunction. This wasn't about her safety. This was about power. And Victor Donovan was not going to stop until he had destroyed everything Zara had fought for. The revelation hit her like a storm. Everything she thought she knew, everything she believed about Marcus, was a lie. But amidst the chaos of her emotions, one thing was clear. She couldn't trust anyone. Not Marcus. Not anyone. As the weight of betrayal settled in, Zara's resolve hardened. She wasn't going to let this break her. She had to take control. She had to fight back. And she would start by uncovering everything Victor Donovan was hiding. But with every passing moment, she could feel the walls closing in. The danger was closer now. The stakes were higher. And she had no idea who, if anyone, she could trust. The tension in the air was palpable. Every movement felt like a ripple in a storm that was about to break. Zara stood by the window of the private jet, her gaze fixed on the horizon, though her thoughts were miles away. The luxury and opulence of the aircraft only made her feel more trapped, more isolated. The dark clouds gathering outside mirrored the storm brewing inside her chest. Betrayal, fear, uncertainty. Marcus' confession had shattered the illusion of control, and with it, the walls of her carefully constructed world had come crashing down. Victor Donovan, the name haunted her, wrapped in layers of lies and power. Everything she had worked for, everything she had believed in, felt distant now, replaced by a growing sense of dread. The photograph, the whispered secrets, the confessions, it all pointed to one thing. She was at the mercy of forces far beyond her comprehension. But even as she stood there, lost in the chaos of her thoughts, she felt something shift. The hum of the engines changed, a subtle vibration, followed by a sound that made her blood run cold, the unmistakable sound of something malfunctioning. Her heart skipped a beat as the lights flickered, casting shadows across the sleek interior of the jet. The pilot's voice crackled through the intercom, but it was strained, unnervingly tense. Attention, everyone. We are experiencing some technical difficulties. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. We'll resolve this shortly. Zara's body froze, her mind racing. The malfunction. Was it happening again? The very thing that had caused the crash earlier, the thing she had been terrified of since Marcus had first brought her onto this flight. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Marcus, she shouted, turning sharply toward him. He was pacing near the back of the cabin, his face a mask of frustration and fear. She rushed toward him, the click of her heels echoing through the quiet cabin. What the hell is going on? His eyes were wide with panic. It's nothing, he said, trying to sound calm. But the tremor in his voice gave him away. Just a minor issue. We'll be fine. Zara wasn't convinced. The unease in the pit of her stomach told her otherwise. There was more to this than just a malfunction. Everything had felt orchestrated. Too perfect, too controlled, like pieces of a puzzle falling into place. And now, as the plane wavered slightly in midair, she couldn't ignore the rising sense of danger. The intercom crackled again, but this time, the voice that came through was not the pilot's. Zara, the voice said, cold and menacing. I know you're listening. Her blood ran cold. It was Victor. Somehow, he had found a way to reach her, to deliver his message directly, in the most sinister way possible. She glanced around the cabin, searching for an explanation, but there was no one else. No one to help her. Victor, she whispered under her breath. Her heart pounded in her chest as she took a step back, her legs unsteady. "What do you want?" Simple. Victor's voice continued, smooth and unbothered. "I want you to understand that no one is safe. Not even you, Zara. Not even Marcus." Zara's eyes locked onto Marcus, who was standing rigidly by the window now, his back to her. His hands were trembling, but he didn't look at her. He didn't need to. She could already feel the truth settling in, like a cold, suffocating weight. Marcus had been compromised. She had always known it. Deep down, she had been a pawn in his game, just as much as she was in Victor's. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded, her voice shaking but determined. "What do you want from me?" Victor's voice was laced with malice, a cruel smile she could almost hear. "It's not about you, Zara. It's about power. It always has been. And now you'll learn that the game isn't about winning. It's about survival." The cabin seemed to close in around her, the noise from the intercom amplified in her ears. She pressed a hand to her forehead, trying to steady herself, trying to make sense of it all. But the more she thought, the more the pieces shifted in a way she hadn't expected. The puzzle wasn't just about her. It was about something much larger. The plane's engine sputtered again, the vibrations growing stronger, almost violent. The stewardess rushed past her, panic in her eyes. "We need to prepare for emergency landing procedures. Fasten your seatbelts." Zara's mind raced. This was no longer just a question of survival on a plane. This was a message, a direct strike from Victor Donovan. Whatever it was he had planned for her, he was ensuring it was going to happen in the most painful, dramatic way possible. Her gaze snapped to Marcus once more. The moment she caught his eyes, she saw it. The guilt, the fear, the betrayal. It was too much to ignore now. "You knew," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You knew about this. About Victor. About everything." Marcus finally turned to face her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were dark with regret. "Zara, I didn't know it would get this far. I didn't want this to happen." But Zara wasn't listening anymore. She had heard enough. She had seen enough. And now she knew that there was no way out, at least not without a price. Victor wasn't just playing games. He was executing a plan, and she was in the center of it. Her hands clenched into fists as the stewardess began directing them to brace for impact. A cold, biting wind rushed through the cabin, and Zara's thoughts raced. She couldn't just sit here. Not anymore. She wasn't going to be a victim in someone else's war. As the plane shuddered violently, Zara stood, her feet firm on the floor as the cabin around her seemed to spin out of control. "Marcus!" she shouted over the noise, but he was already moving too. He was already retreating into himself, lost in the shadows of his own choices. This was it, the moment where everything changed. And Zara realized that she could either let this break her, or she could take control. It was up to her. With a determined step forward, Zara moved toward the cockpit, her mind set on one thing: survival. And as she passed Marcus, she caught one final glance. This time, there was no hope in his eyes. Only the cold truth of betrayal. The second turning point had arrived, and with it, the realization that her fate was no longer in her own hands. It was in the hands of the enemy. The plane was descending faster than Zara had ever experienced, the world outside becoming a blur of storm clouds and flashing lights. Every muscle in her body was taut with fear, but also with something else, a growing sense of determination. She couldn't let this be the end. Not like this. Not with Victor Donovan pulling the strings behind the scenes, manipulating everything from the shadows. Inside the cabin, chaos had erupted. The stewardess had fallen silent, her face pale as she moved mechanically, guiding the few passengers who remained in the cabin to their seats, strapping them in, though it was clear they were all afraid. Even Marcus had long since stopped trying to reassure anyone, his face pale, sweat dripping from his brow as he sat by the emergency exit, his mind seemingly lost in the same web of guilt and fear that Zara had become entangled in. But Zara wasn't ready to give up, not yet. She had been a pawn in a game far beyond her comprehension, but now she could feel the tide turning. Something deep inside her, something raw and furious, was awakening, and she needed to find a way to fight back. Victor, she whispered under her breath. The name, like an incantation, a reminder of who had placed her here in this moment of life or death. His words echoed in her ears, growing louder with each passing second. The game isn't about winning, it's about survival. As the plane continued its steep descent, the pressure inside the cabin changed. Zara could feel the tension in her bones, the panic rising like bile in the back of her throat. The control she had once thought she wielded over her wealth, her identity, her life, was slipping away with each passing second. The storm outside felt like a mirror to the turmoil inside her. She glanced at Marcus again, his face still hidden behind his hands as he muttered something to himself, as though he were begging for forgiveness. Zara's heart twisted, not with empathy, but with the sharp sting of betrayal. All of it, the lies, the manipulations, the silent complicity in her own suffering, flashed before her eyes in one overwhelming rush. And in that moment, the truth settled in her gut like lead. Marcus was not her ally. He never had been. He had been another puppet, another player in Victor's grand scheme, someone who had once made her believe in a future that was just an illusion. The roar of the engines filled her ears again as the plane dipped lower, the ground now visible in the distance, an approaching reality that felt almost surreal. There was no time to waste. She had to act. Zara forced herself to move, pushing past the seat where Marcus sat frozen in his own guilt. She reached the cockpit door, her pulse hammering in her neck. The door was locked, but she had seen enough. She knew how these systems worked. Her fingers, steady despite the storm raging in her chest, found the override mechanism, the emergency release. The door slid open with a soft hiss. The cockpit was bathed in red emergency lights, the instruments flickering, warning beeps filling the small space. The pilot was hunched over, his knuckles white against the controls, trying to stabilize the aircraft. His eyes darted to her as she stepped inside, and for a brief moment, she saw a flicker of recognition, of surprise. "Get out," Zara commanded, her voice colder than she'd ever heard it before. It wasn't a request, it was an order. The pilot hesitated, but Zara's gaze didn't waver. She wasn't here to negotiate anymore. For a moment, it seemed as though the world had paused. The storm outside howled, the wind battering the plane. Zara's heart raced in her chest, every beat a drum of war. The pilot slowly relinquished control, stepping back toward the door with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Once he was out, Zara slid into the seat, her fingers grazing over the controls as if she had done this 1,000 times before. The plane continued to plummet, but Zara was focused now, her mind moving with precision. She was no longer just a passenger. She was in control of her fate. Her eyes scanned the dashboard, each gauge and light offering a small piece of a complex puzzle. With every twist of the dials and every push of the buttons, the plane began to level out, though the speed of its descent had not yet slowed. Zara took a deep breath, her hands gripping the controls with a steady intensity. She couldn't afford mistakes, not when everything was hanging by the thinnest of threads. Behind her, the sound of footsteps echoed in the cabin. It was Marcus, approaching hesitantly, still caught in the haze of his own inner turmoil. He had no words, no grand apologies. There was only the quiet realization that they were both far past the point of no return. "Get out," Zara repeated, not turning around to face him. Her eyes were fixed ahead, locked on the horizon through the small cockpit window. "But," Marcus began, his voice hoarse, shaking with the weight of everything unsaid between them. "Zara, we can't." "I'm not letting this happen," she interrupted, her tone fierce, resolute. "Victor wanted to break me, but I won't let him. Not now. Not like this." There was a pause, a long silence that stretched between them, but Zara didn't wait for him to understand. She had learned something crucial in this moment. There was no time for forgiveness, no room for explanations. This was about survival, about reclaiming power that had been stolen from her. The storm outside intensified, the winds howling against the plane's fragile frame, but Zara refused to flinch. She was no longer afraid. The fear she had carried for so long, of Victor, of Marcus, of her own vulnerability, had turned into something far more dangerous, something primal. The plane jerked violently, the altitude and speed making it harder to control. Zara's body tensed, every muscle strained against the forces trying to tear the aircraft apart. She gritted her teeth, focused solely on the task at hand. If she failed here, there would be no second chance. Marcus was still standing there, his face drawn with concern. But it wasn't just concern for her, it was for himself. He knew, as she did, that Victor's reach was far longer than either of them had anticipated, and that the real fight was about to begin. Suddenly, the intercom crackled to life again, and this time it wasn't just Victor's voice. The calm, detached tone was replaced by something much more menacing. "Zara," Victor said, his voice smooth and cold. "You can't run from me. You think you've won, but you're only delaying the inevitable. This is bigger than you, bigger than anyone on that plane. I hold all the cards now." Zara's grip on the controls tightened. The storm outside raged, but in that moment, she felt something even stronger: defiance. She wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. She was fighting for her future, for her identity, for everything she had lost in the web of lies Victor had spun around her. "Victor," she said, her voice steady, unwavering, "you've underestimated me." And with that, she made her final move. The storm outside had finally begun to relent, its fury waning as the plane coasted through the last stretch of turbulent skies. Zara's hands, still gripped tightly on the controls, were slick with sweat, but her mind was clear. For the first time in what felt like forever, she was free from the weight of Victor's influence, even if only for a brief moment. Her heart was still pounding in her chest, the adrenaline from the past few minutes still coursing through her veins. The descent had slowed, the violent shaking of the aircraft turning into a soft hum. The roaring winds had faded into nothing more than a gentle whisper against the hull. But the silence that filled the cockpit wasn't peaceful. It was deafening. The calm before the storm. The calm before the inevitable truth. Victor was gone. Zara had ensured that. His threats, his manipulations, the web of lies he had spun around her life, they were all behind her now. But there was no triumph in it, no victory dance. Instead, there was only the weight of what came next. The realization that the man who had orchestrated her downfall was out of the picture, but the world they had built, the world of lies, betrayals, and secrecy, was far from over. Zara released a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Her grip loosened on the controls just as the plane leveled out. Her eyes flickered to the horizon again. The sky, once bruised and angry, was now tinged with the soft orange of dawn, the clouds breaking apart to reveal the first signs of daylight. But felt too soon, too far away from the shadows she had just emerged from. She glanced over her shoulder. Marcus was still there, standing silently by the door of the cockpit, his eyes hollow with regret. He had been a casualty of this war, a player who had been swept up in something much larger than either of them. He had once been her ally, someone she had trusted, but the truth had shattered that illusion. There was no going back, not now. No matter how many apologies, no matter how many regrets he voiced, the damage had been done. "Zara," Marcus began, his voice low and strained, but she didn't turn to face him. She couldn't. "You've done enough," Zara said quietly, her tone firm, cutting through the air like a blade. Her voice carried no bitterness, but it was final, like the closing of a door. Marcus opened his mouth to say something more, but Zara didn't wait for him to finish. Her eyes remained locked on the horizon, her mind far away. She was done talking. There was no more room for words, for explanations. The things they had shared, the moments they had built together, had been torn apart by the weight of betrayal. There was nothing left to salvage. Marcus left without another word. Zara sat alone in the cockpit, her thoughts racing faster than the plane could ever fly. She wasn't sure what came next, but she knew one thing for certain. She had taken back control of her life. In that moment, amidst the ruins of everything Victor had tried to destroy, Zara felt a quiet resolve settle within her. Her fingers grazed the control panel again. The turbulence was gone, and the worst of the storm had passed. But the reality was still ahead of her. One of uncertainty, one where the pieces of her shattered identity had to be pieced back together. There would be no clean slate, no smooth road ahead. But there was freedom. The kind of freedom that came from surviving the fight, from standing in the wreckage, and knowing that no one, no matter how powerful, could hold her down anymore. The intercom crackled again, and for a moment, Zara stiffened. Her heart skipped a beat as she heard the voice, a voice she had once feared, one she had thought she was rid of. "Zara!" Victor's voice purred through the speakers, still cold, still calculating. "You may have won this round, but the game isn't over. You think you're free, but you're only playing into my hands." Zara closed her eyes for a moment, exhaling slowly. She had known this was coming, had known that Victor wouldn't go down so easily. But this time, there was no panic, no dread creeping into her chest. There was just a quiet defiance. "Victor," she replied, her voice clear, steady. "You're right about one thing. The game isn't over. But this time, I'm the one who gets to decide the rules." She didn't wait for his response, didn't need to hear it. She disconnected the intercom and sat back in the seat, closing her eyes for a moment. For the first time in ages, Zara felt like she could breathe. The weight of the game, of the manipulation, of the people pulling the strings, had fallen away. She wasn't running from anyone anymore. The plane continued its steady descent, the clouds parting in front of her like a veil lifting, revealing the path ahead. Zara's mind was already moving past the immediate threat of Victor, already plotting the next step. She had a choice now. The pieces she had once believed were out of her reach, her past, her identity, her future, were in her hands. But the question remained, what would she do with them? Back in the main cabin, passengers had begun to stir. A few of them looked out of the windows, noting the lightening sky and the quieting storm. Some were still dazed, others whispering among themselves, but there was an unmistakable shift in the air. The tension had eased, and a fragile peace had settled in. The same passengers who had once looked at Zara with suspicion were now regarding her with something else, something closer to respect. But it wasn't their gaze that mattered. It was her own. Zara knew that the road ahead wouldn't be simple. She had no illusions about that. The revelations of the past few hours had rocked her world to its core. There would be fallout. People would ask questions. She couldn't just vanish into obscurity now, not after everything that had happened. But in that moment, as she looked out at the dawn breaking on the horizon, she felt something else, a possibility, the chance to rebuild, to move forward, not as the victim of Victor's schemes, but as someone who had learned to wield her own power. She would have to confront the shadows of her past, sure, but she would do it on her terms. She had learned what it meant to survive, and to fight when it mattered most. As the plane touched down, Zara didn't glance back. There was nothing for her in the past anymore. Ahead of her lay an uncertain future, but for the first time in her life, that future was hers to shape. Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more meaningful stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.